Welcome to the Everyday Rabbi. This is a new podcast, a new idea, a new concept. We are here with the intention of sharing Jewish conversations about life, about Judaism, about purpose, and all good things. Maybe some conversations that would happen behind closed doors, maybe things you've heard about and never discussed, maybe things you never heard about. But the idea is to have an interesting conversation with interesting people and to share some wisdom, share some new perspective. And with that, we are here in the studio, the Everyday Rabbi, Levik Dubov, myself, and I have a guest here.
My name is William Branca. We got to meet each other about, I think it's 2 weeks ago.
It's relatively recent.
Yeah.
And we have some friends who, sometimes you have conversations with people you know for 10, 12 years, and this is more like 10, 12 days.
Yeah. So
relatively new relationship, old conversations.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's cool. The whole intention behind at least this podcast is kind of diving into just the basics of Judaism, which is so true to where I am right now in my journey of learning things. I think it's cool that I got connected to you on that basis of saying like, hey, like I know Judaism because I grew up in a Jewish community, but like in more of a conservative upbringing. So I was like, what else is there? Like, is there more to this than just the same thing I've seen for the last 10 years? Mm-hmm. And it's been cool learning along that process and kind of digging into what is Judaism.
So just before we get into it, your background?
Oh, yeah. Well, my background is in cybersecurity and digital marketing. I've been doing that professionally for about 6-7 years now. I run my own company called Pivot Business Solutions, where we're kind of a one-stop shop for anything you need business-wise. That's my dad's side of the business, where he does all the business consulting. And then me, I'm all your digital marketing, SEO, and hacking. That's my day job.
White hat
hacking, and the asterisks there, yeah.
Protecting from the inside.
Yeah.
So back to, the topic, Judaism 101. Give me a headway. Where did you start? How did you get on this path?
So I was bar mitzvahed 10 years ago, and that was the last time I set foot in a synagogue, up until actually September of last year. I don't know what it was. I felt this longing for more. And the only place that I've seen that, and I have a lot of great friends of mine that are religious in their own way, and I saw that they felt connected to something. And I'm like, I always wanted to learn more. I just never had that initiative when I was younger. So I started going back to synagogue. I think I went to 6 or 7 different synagogues.
Wow.
Trying to find what felt right. And I landed on one, which felt like the one that I grew up with in New York. But I didn't feel like it was what I wanted. It was that aspect of like, I felt like I was at home like I used to, but I was like, it didn't give me what I wanted out of what I was looking for. I was looking for more. I was looking for, well, what is Judaism? Like what we say these prayers, but why? I'm a very big research guy, so I was always like, I was asking questions, and I'm like, so we pray 3 times a day. What's the background of praying 3 times a day? Like tefillin, what's tefillin? And I was in this mindset of like, I just want information, and it was like, nah, well, the answer I always got was like, well, you do what you want to do. And I was like, but it's either, I've always been the it is or it isn't kind of person, and it is or it isn't. And I was just like, well, it can't be, well, if you want to do that, you do that, right? And I think that was the conversation we started
one
with.
Interesting observation, which I've had in the little time that we know each other, is that I've expressed to you in the past that if there's anything you have a question about, any detail or any sort of nuance or, entailing aspect of Jewish practice, that you have, let me know and I'll answer it. And you've taken me up on that offer. And I'll notice that you'll notice things and like, hey, why do we do things this way? Why do we do things that way? And it's interesting both to probably yourself and to myself, because I'm always learning as well as you are, that there really is a reason behind almost every single thing we do.
Oh, yeah.
So when you talk about why, when you talk about, what is the deeper, purpose, answer, perspective, there really always is. One thing I love about rabbis is, especially Chabad rabbis, is when you ask them a question, they almost have to decide how to answer the question, not whether they know the answer. Do you want the short answer? Do you want the long answer? Do you want the easy answer? Do you want the Kabbalistic answer? And I think that one of the beautiful things about Judaism, much like a gem, we say in Torah that there's 70 facets to every concept. There's 70 perspectives, just like a perfectly cut diamond would have 70 different sides, so to speak. The Torah has 70 different sides on 4 different levels of interpretation in so many different languages, in so many different cultural or whatever have you, whatever type of expression. It may mean something in the 21st century very differently than it would have been in the 11th century or the 1st century or 11th century BC, right? So give me something that you've observed or learned in the last few weeks that you were surprised to learn.
That I was surprised. There's so much. I think the first thing for me was the purpose behind keeping kosher. That for me was like a piece where I was like, well, why? What? I've always been told, well, you keep kosher to keep kosher. I never understood the reasoning behind it, and when that was explained to me, it was just like a flash in my mind. Like, well, that makes so much more sense. It's not, well, I just don't eat it because it says don't eat it. It's like, and you can explain it more than probably I can, but like the reason why you do the thing isn't just to do the thing. It's for all the other benefits you get out of it by doing that piece. Like talking about like the enhancement of everything else that comes from eating kosher.
Right. So if you're feeding your soul, or let's go to the body first. If you're feeding the body healthy food, you're going to have, in addition to the value of eating healthy food, you also have the residual effect of being healthy and feeling healthy and having more energy and so on. Just cutting out bad food will give you a boost physically. So spiritually, it would make sense that it's the same way, that by feeding your soul, you get soul benefits. And I think that unfortunately, people so often focus on the physical benefits of kosher or the health benefits of kosher. And there are some Jewish health doesn't mean kosher. Kosher doesn't mean healthy. It's one of the great myths of kosher certification. We walk into a kosher facility or a facility that wants to become certified kosher. The first question they ask is, how do we get our food blessed? And what do we have to do to become kosher? And we always correct those two, is that there's nothing that we can bless to make the food kosher. And either your process is currently kosher or it isn't. So you're either are already kosher, or you will have to change something in your process, ingredient line, production facility in order to make the facility kosher.
Yeah.
But that's all in terms of the practical, the pragmatic, yes or no binary, is it kosher, is it not? But the question of why do we keep kosher? So the simple answer is, which is probably the most boring answer, is because God said so.
Yeah.
But it's also the most profound answer, in that after we understand all the benefits, and after, whether they're physical or emotional or mental or spiritual, at the end of the day, the most important thing is to do the mitzvah because it's a godly act, because it's a divinely connected. The word for mitzvah in Hebrew comes from the word savta, which means connection. And there's a fascinating quote in the Tanya about this, and the Alter Rebbe uses the examples of strings, that you have these ropes that connect one thing to another, and if the rope is severed, then you don't have the same connection as you had before. Of course, a rope can be reconnected once it becomes severed. What's really interesting, I believe very, very firmly that if the Alter Rebbe could have, he would have used bars on a cell phone as a or internet access as a much more practical example, because when you're out in the middle of the hillbillies and you have no phone, you have no cell phone access, no data, and you're trying to send a simple data packet and you're not getting through, it's frustrating. And when you have all the bars swinging, I mean, you're getting full internet access and your upload download is at full speed, you feel like there's no resistance. You feel like you're floating. You feel like you're just one thing to the next. And that's really how Judaism should feel. There shouldn't be a resistance. There shouldn't be this sense of restriction of like, I don't feel inspired. I don't feel spiritual. I don't feel connected.
Well, I think that was the biggest piece to me when I started the journey to become more in tune with Judaism, was I felt like it was such a struggle to do anything. It's like they told me that the best way to start is to just start praying 3 times a day. So I started doing it, but it's like when you don't understand the reason behind doing something and you don't feel that connection, you're just doing something to do something. And I think that was the biggest piece for me, where I was just like, I know there's got to be a reason.
Okay, so let's get into this.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite fundamental ideas within Judaism. So let's go a few steps. Judaism is what is Judaism, right? So Judaism 101. In very simple form, there have been many prophets, many individuals who have felt or perceived a sense of divine communication. Abraham would be a great example. Even Moses, burning bush, would be a great example.
Okay.
But then there is national, I would call it a Judaism construct. And that didn't start until Sinai. So people always ask, was Abraham Jewish? Or was Adam Jewish? Or was Moses Jewish? Were the Jewish people, were the Israelites Jewish? And Judaism, of course, you can get distracted by the term, Judea, which came from already Second Temple period. But going back to just the fundamentals, regardless of the semantics of our history, we're the same people, right? We started off as the Hebrews, and we became Israelites, and then we went to Jews, and so on. And that's what we're known as today. But if you go back to the original source, it all started at Sinai. So, from a Jewish perspective, the only way, and I sort of sent you a little blurb on this the other day, not so simple blurb, but fundamentally, no one would ever know what God wants from them unless God communicates it. And if God were to communicate it, he would have to communicate it to mankind. And in a sense, that's what God does in the Torah. Not in a sense, in practice, that's what God does in the Torah. Now, the Torah requires teachers. The Torah requires commentary and context. Desperately requires context, like every teaching, like every discipline. You'd never trust a pilot who read the book and never got in a plane cockpit before, and you wouldn't trust a surgeon who never actually experienced surgery before, and because he read the manual 5 times or 100 times, you still wouldn't trust him. He could have read the manual 1,000 times. If he was never in a surgery before, you're going to prefer a different doctor. So in Jewish thought, Sinai is where it all begins. So God reveals himself to the Jewish people at Sinai in a fascinating account. You can read the Torah; it's all there in black and white. It's the bestseller in history of any book in any period in any language, and then you have this teacher. So you have a phenomenal book, and you have a phenomenal teacher. Of course, God had to teach the teacher before the teacher could teach the students. And that's the 40-day, Moses is on the mountain 40 days twice, right? Once in the beginning, Shavuot, when he receives the Torah the first time, and then goes up for a second dose, which is, you never heard this?
No.
So there's an interesting, if you follow the 40 years, and one of the most fascinating things about Torah study is, I once heard a phenomenal line that Jewish people read into the Bible, and many others read out of the Bible. We're not so much about reading out of, we're interested in reading into. So we will pick up on a nuance, on a verse, on a question, on a grammatical, so to speak, inconsistency in the text. And that's like a flag. Like, hey, look here. Sort of like the door that, it looks like something's odd about the door, like sort of Super Mario, you see something in the bricks, like there must be something, and you try to see what's behind there, and suddenly you experience a whole new level, a whole new paradigm. And that's really how Torah knowledge evolves as a study, as a discipline. So Moses will say something to the Jewish people, and at first it sounds okay and sounds practical, and then you start thinking about it, and you realize it sounds ridiculous, and you realize something else is going on here. This is not a normal conversation. So in terms of the Torah, right? You have just historically, you have 40 years. The entire Torah, besides for the book of Genesis. Genesis is sort of a preamble. Then you have the book of Exodus, Shemot, which really starts from the beginning of the Jewish people's history, all the way until the end of Deuteronomy, which is basically the end of Moses' life, the end of the 40-year period when the Jewish people finally go into the land of Israel, which they've been promised really since the times of Abraham. So the first book is introductory. There's very few commandments in the first book. I believe there's 2, circumcision and to have children, or and vice versa, right? The first one is to have children. The second one's circumcision. We learn from Abraham and his sons. That's it. That's the whole first book. So the first book is really midrashic in a sense. It's very introductory. It's very narrative driven. It's sort of painting the picture with many, many lessons and teachings. Obviously, it's not just narrative. But in terms of practice, there's very little practice that you get out of, or practical teachings you get out of the first book in terms of commandments. Yeah. Once you get to the second, third, fourth, and fifth, we're talking, you could have a portion with 100 commandments, just one after another, just rattling it off. Wow. So in the context of 40 years, Moses, we're gonna start from after Egypt. So they come out of Egypt, 50 days later, or actually let's even go a year before. So a year and 50 days before the giving of the Torah, Moses comes to Egypt and tells the Jewish people, in exactly a year and 50 days, we're gonna hear God speak. And that entire year is the year of the plagues. Tradition tells us that every plague lasted about 1 month. So we had about a week of warning Pharaoh, a week of the plague, a week of Pharaoh regretting, a week of sort of interim period, and then the whole thing starts over again. So that happens 10 times. And finally, on the last night of the 10th plague, literally in the middle of the plague, the firstborn are dying in Egypt, and Pharaoh says, enough is enough, you guys got to go. Moses, right, in true form, Moses says, tomorrow, right? We're gonna leave during midday. We're not gonna leave at night. People will say we escaped. We're gonna leave tomorrow morning, bright and early. And they go on this journey into the desert. A lot to talk about, but we're just talking the historical, right? So 50 days, Moses we have 50 days to prepare now. God will speak on the mountain, which is really fascinating theologically, in the sense that Moses is about to introduce God. No one ever did that before. Every other prophet shows up and says, God spoke to me. God gave me a message. God told me this. God told me that, right? Whether it's true or not, nobody really knows. Here Moses is saying, in 50 days, you're going to hear God speak. God will speak to you. And this is all in the text. So Moses prepares the people.
So the people hear God at Mount Sinai.
100%. It's the only time that there is what we call in theology mass revelation. That God reveals himself, speaks to millions of people. The Torah there says 600,000 families, men between the age of 20 and 60, which is basically the army. But every man represents a wife and children and adults, old people, and so on. So estimates are between some estimates between 2 on the very low side, maybe 5 on the very high side. But approximately 3 million people hear this revelation of God. According to tradition, the whole world heard this. It was a international event, made the papers. God's giving the Torah to the Jewish people of Mount Sinai, pretty much. And the way this kicked off was God gave the Torah, gave the commandments, the 10 commandments as we know it, starting with, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. God introduces himself. Again, so much to talk about in terms of the midrashic and the Kabbalistic and the practical and so on, but let's just keep it simple. We're talking historically. So then after this revelation, which was a life-changing experience for everybody there. I just to jump the gun, I love the arguments of maybe they were high on shrooms or maybe there was some sort of psychedelic experience. The fact that our people, as skeptical as we are, if somebody would say, hey, God's going to speak, we would stay away from any sort of we want to see this. We want to check the mountain, pyrotechnics. We want to check for mics. We want to check and the truth is that Moses really introduces that idea. We're getting ready for God to speak. You do whatever you got to do. You get ready yourself. But whether you're ready or not, God will speak to us. So after the 10 commandments, go ahead.
I was going to say, so how does it come down? Because the way I was always taught was God spoke to Moses. And then Moses spoke to the Jewish people. And this is the thing that with what you're saying, I question, obviously, how does he come? If they're all hearing it, how are they worshiping idols when he comes down from the mountain?
Right. So what happens is in sequence, God tells Moses, tell the people get ready. Moses tells the people get ready. The people say to Moses, we want to hear God. Actually, originally they say we want to see God. And Moses says, no, you can't see God. You can only hear God. And even hearing was, I'll explain in a second. Hearing was almost too much to handle. So God comes on the mountain and starts to say the first commandment. And the Midrash tells us, Midrash is the backstory, is that the Jewish people were so frightened by hearing God speak, as by the way anybody would be when they heard God speak. Prophets would go into a state of awe, a state of shock when they heard God speak. Some more than others. Those who are more familiar with their experience, we can talk about prophecy and prophet school and all that, and non-prophet school. So when God speaks to you, it's not a simple experience. It is intense because it is the creator of the universe communicating to you however that is communicated. Again, in prophecy, there's different voices you can hear and so on. And, someone once asked me, was Moses schizophrenic? And I think that it's a great question. Moses was not schizophrenic, but you could very easily confuse schizophrenia and prophecy. And there's ways to test whether or not you're hearing voices in your head or whether it's actually God speaking. There's ways to test if a dream is real, whether a dream is just hearsay. Usually it's hearsay. Usually it's just, your mind just discombobulating everything, all the data processing in your head. It's a bunch of, Lego pieces fleshing around. But going back to the point is Moses, we're supposed to be on the 40 day, right? Yeah. So just to zoom in a little bit on this. So the Jewish people hear God speak. They run back about 12 kilometers out of shock and die. God has to revive them. This is what the Medrash tells us, right? Brings them back to the mountain and says, calm down. Doesn't say calm down, but says, okay, second commandment. Says the second commandment, don't have any other gods before me. Don't worship any other gods. They heard that, right? Same thing happens. They run away, they pass out. God has to revive them, resurrect them, bring them back to the mountain. And the Jewish people go to God. This is in the Torah. It's not Midrash. This is in the Torah. They say to Moses, we cannot handle the word of God. You go to God and find out what he wants from us, and then we will listen to what he has to say. So in other words, they inaugurate Moses as the prophet, as the teacher. You find out what God wants. It's too much for us to handle.
So they heard it.
So initially they heard it, and they couldn't handle it, right? And then they say to Moses, you just find out what God wants, and we'll listen. So Moses then, this is according to most interpretations, that the first two is from God, and then the other 8 Moses really saying secondhand, and the whole rest of the Torah really has that flow. The Torah is telling you what God told Moses, what Moses tells the Jewish people in third person, the Torah being the third person. Torah obviously is God's wisdom, it's God's mind, so to speak, speaking, but the context is the Torah is telling you about the conversation between God and the Jewish people. And that's basically the end of the 10 Commandments.
Okay.
After that, Moses goes up on the mountain. God says, Moses, come up on the mountain. Moses goes up on the mountain and stays there for 40 days, 40 nights, and basically gets the download of the entire, what we would call today oral tradition, or the entire tradition, or the entire Torah. So at the end of the 40 years, just to parenthetically throw this in, at the end of the 40 years, he's going to write down a bunch of Torahs and give it to the Jewish people and say, this is the textbook that we were studying for the last 40 years. But in the beginning of that, he has to get the information. So he goes upstairs, he goes up on top of the mountain, gets the revelation of the Torah, and then, as you mentioned, comes back down the mountain for many reasons beyond the scope of this conversation. The Jewish people, some actually weren't even Jews. There were many Egyptians involved, and they, dedicated to their lifestyle of idol worship an idol, a golden calf. Moses is incensed. He's enraged. He throws down the tablets, shattering them, and the Jewish people realize they messed up. So he spends the next 40 days asking God to forgive the Jewish people for their sin, for this terrible thing, which is the worst thing that happened since the tree of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge. And after 40 days, God says, I will forgive them. By the way, just in terms of dates, Moses went up on the mountain after Shavuot, which is, so they left Egypt, Passover. 50 days later is Shavuot, which is the holiday of the giving of the Torah, commemorating it, the 6th of Sivan. 40 days later, if I'm not mistaken, is the 17th of Tammuz. 17th of Tammuz is a fast day in the Jewish calendar. One of the reasons why we fast, amongst other calamities that happened on that day. The first calamity was that Moses broke the tablets. That's coming down the mountain 40 days later. So 6th of Sivan, 17th of Tammuz, exactly 40 days. 17th of Tammuz, he starts to ask forgiveness. And that goes pretty much until the beginning of Elul, which Elul is, as we know, the holiday of forgiveness.
Yeah.
And on the first day of Elul, prior to the first day of Elul, God says to Moses, I will grant the Jewish people forgiveness. Now, how did we know that forgiveness was real? How did we know that God really meant it sincerely? Or was he just saying it? So Moses goes back on the mountain a second time for 40 days, from the beginning of Elul until Yom Kippur. We know Yom Kippur as the Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
We know Yom Kippur as the day of fasting and so on. But most people don't know Yom Kippur as the day of the second giving of the Torah. So Moses comes down the second
He has
time,
another set of tablets?
a second set of tablets, and we kept these two tablets for many, right, since the beginning of time, since this event. And we had the broken tablets, which represented our failures and our insecurities and our problems. We could have a whole class just on this. And then there is the full set of tablets, traditionally kept in the Ark of the Covenant. There was a second ark for the broken tablets. And these two arks represented perfection and, what will the opposite of perfection be? Imperfection, dealing with all the problems of life, becoming better. So now you have Moses coming down the mountain, and that's when, as we say on Yom Kippur, Salachti kidvarecha, I have forgiven you according to your word. God says to Moses, based on your request, I am granting the Jewish people forgiveness, which is actually interesting because the first time we have national forgiveness. So we've had forgiveness on a personal level before in the Torah, but this is the first time, and you can even argue one of the reasons why the Jewish people were tempted to sin in the first place is we know this forgiveness generally, or we know this forgiveness individually. Is there forgiveness nationally? Could we screw this up? Could we, after God told us, do not sin with the do not worship idols, as typical Jewish,
because they were told that, they heard it, and then were brought
But
back.
isn't that so fascinating that you tell a people, God tells a people, don't serve idols. And almost like a rhetorical question is, what would happen if we did serve idols? Almost as a curiosity, but not so much as an intellectual curiosity, but also how important is this program? In other words, is it something that if it doesn't work, it was a nice run, I'll just go on with my day? Or is this so important to God, this Torah business, that even if you screw it all up, he's going to make it work, and we're going to make it work? And I think that after the second giving of the Torah, which is what Yom Kippur represents, after the whole year that we didn't accomplish what we're supposed to accomplish in the past year, God says, you know what? I'm going to give you another year. And this year is going to be better. And we're going to get all the stuff done that we want to get done last year that we screwed up on, but I'm going to give you a second chance. And this is common throughout the Torah. Very common. This idea of tshuva, this idea of return, this idea of recalibration. It didn't work. Okay, there's always tomorrow. There's always next day. There's always next year. And you can get caught up in that cycle of like, I'll just do it tomorrow if there's always tomorrow. But you don't know when your last day is. You don't know what's going to be tomorrow. So, today is the day to do it, as the Torah says. If not now, when, as the Mishnah says. So, this significance of God giving the second commandments, the second set of tablets rather, and forgiving the Jewish people as a nation, that was real. That was something that special and really charged the Jewish people up for the next 40 years. And then you have to imagine that for the next 40 years, approximately, I think we're down to like 39 and a half, the Jewish people were sitting with Moses, and there's many teachings about how this would go down practically, and study Torah. They would say, okay, what is Shabbat? What is kosher? And you have to imagine that it wasn't just like, hey, keep kosher, and Moses would just go back to his tent. What is kosher? How do we do kosher? Do we kosherize ceramic? Do we kosherize? And you even find instances in the Torah where you sort of get flashes of this. You get little like snippets of the law. But Shabbat, for example, a major theme in Judaism in the Torah, and there's barely any information in the Torah text itself about what Shabbat is and how we observe Shabbat. Yeah. There's no information about sacrifices and how to sacrifice an animal, even though God tells Moses, sacrifice the animals as I commanded you. Build the tabernacle according to the diagram, according to the picture that I showed you. These are all texts. So you have to ask yourself, And then forget about words that are completely enigmatic,
Okay.
like tefillin, which it actually doesn't even say tefillin. It says totafot. Totafot is not even a Hebrew word. It doesn't mean anything. Tradition, the Midrash tells us that totafot is two words, one being African and one being Egyptian, meaning two and two. So you're left with put two and two on your head, as a sign. Yeah, as a sign, between your eyes and on your arm. Like what is going on? The only way, you could try to put the entire Torah into AI and see what it spits out. It is so different than anything you could imagine. And that's with the context that we have today. Imagine without the context. Imagine without Judaism as we know it. And there's so many examples of this, of the Torah telling us things that you would not be able to decipher without a teacher. And this is really how learning works. You have a textbook, which the textbook is not, in the case of the Torah, the textbook is the word, obviously.
Yeah.
But the teacher tells you what the textbook means. The textbook doesn't tell you what the textbook means because there's only so much you can put in a book.
Well, I think that piece where it's like the whole oral tradition of the Torah was a whole nother piece that almost escaped me in my youth and when I was learning stuff, because I was like, I would read the book and I'm just like, but where does it say it in here? And they're like, no, it's there. But there was never the explanation that no, there's this entire expanse of information that was never put into paper, that was just oral tradition, that just when I started looking and seeing, oh, that's where it all was.
Right.
Things start making so much more sense.
And there's so much to talk about in that vein of oral tradition. But I think that in order to understand it correctly, you have to simply understand it in its basic construct. A lot of things we do in life have information that surrounds it, things that we just know, right? A simple example would be our birthdays, right? So your birth certificate is, let's say, the written, right?
Yeah.
But how do you know that it's actually your birthday? How do you know your parents are your parents? Today, of course, there's so much data and tracking and stuff like that. But 30 years ago, how did we know? And there's an interesting idea that the only way you can really know something, and we can get into the whole idea of epistemology and logic and knowledge, but just to keep it simple for this, is you know things because of testimony, because of witnesses. So when you experience something, it's very, very hard to convince somebody they didn't experience something. Now, you could convince somebody that their experience was not exactly what they remember from the experience is different than how things went in reality. There's a very interesting idea, which I heard recently. Someone was talking about what is the significance of two witnesses in Torah? You find you need two witnesses for everything, for every event. At least two witnesses. You could have hundreds, but you need at least two people to corroborate a witness testimony. And what's so interesting is that if you have any event, pick an event, right? A crime, or God forbid, or something fantastic like a show, and you ask two people who are at the same show, fully capable, sane adults, what did you experience? And you might get two completely different answers.
Yeah.
So it's not so much that people will disagree. That happens all the time.
Yeah.
When people agree, that's where it's really fascinating. So, when the two rabbis, there's two rabbis, three opinions. When all the rabbis agree on something, that there's truth there. When people agree on something, there's truth there. So, for example, the idea of a flood story is prevalent in many, many different theologies, religions, cultures. It's not just in the Torah. It's what we call extra biblical. There's instances of it everywhere. Now, was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the same as the flood? That's already up for debate. But we find instances of universal stories, let's say, in different contexts that all point to some sort of original flood story, origin story. The same thing applies to the Sinai, right? 600,000 able-bodied adult men all agree on one thing. They're all Jewish, right? Keep that in mind, right? That's very bright, Nobel Peace Prize winners, grandfathers and grandmothers. Yeah. And we all agree on this. Yes, that's what we experienced. This is what happened. And this is true generations afterwards. Of course, there's going to be disagreements on other things, and that's the nature of the Talmud to discuss. And sometimes what you see is not what you thought you saw. Fine, we understand that. But isn't it so much more fascinating when you have two witnesses who come and testify that this is what happened? And it's interesting. I saw today that in the book of Yeshayahu, the book of Isaiah, God calls the Jewish people his witnesses. We are the witnesses that what happened, that there was a Sinai, that there was an Egypt, that there was a Torah, and that there was a Moses, and that tradition of ethical, moral, just, righteous living has a source. It's not just made up in some cave somewhere. We experienced it. We were there. Now, people could question that belief, no different than people question the Holocaust. People question if the massacre of Gaza on October 7th happened, which it was GoPro'd, but people will argue about it. And this is the world we live in. Yeah. But then when you have so many people who share that experience firsthand, we were there, we saw it. We and they all have the same story. Yeah. You can start to believe that there's actually some sort of semblance of reality and truth in that.
And I think that's such an interesting statement of people coming together to say those things. And then there's the whole other issue of you can have as many witnesses as you want, but what and this is something I've experienced in my life is when can two Jews agree on anything? I remember, I've had this experience where it's we can argue for days, but it's so powerful that we both agree that that's true. It's there's so much more power in that than in all the other disagreements. I've reading the disagreements in the Talmud right now. I sit there sometimes and I'm they're both arguing the exact same thing in this, they're talking about the same problem the same way and they come to the same answer, but it's 3 pages of just arguing their point. Right. To come back to the same thing.
So a few observations. First of all, it's interesting that when there's a debate, there is always a thirst for knowledge and a intention of coming to a conclusion. We're not arguing for the sake of arguing because I have my party, you have your party. We are arguing in order to learn something. Yeah. And that's why a lot of times you'll have an opinion and the opinion will be rebutted, right? If that's the right word. It will be shot down. And then you won't hear from that opinion ever again. The Talmud will present a possible answer and then reject the answer. Interestingly, in the Rebbe's talks, you'll find the exact same thing. The Rebbe will, in a Talmudic style, it's the brisk style of Talmudic, erudition, is you will have a thought and you will entertain the thought, you will counter the thought, why can't you answer this, why can't you answer that? And then you'll come to a conclusion. So what's the difference of the conclusion with all the disagreements and without them is the difference of Judaism with a Babylonian Talmud and without a Babylonian Talmud, in that you have this knowledge, you have this understanding. We discussed this. We had the whole discussion 1,000 years ago in Babylonia. We were, in Baghdad, we were discussing this idea, and here's the conclusion we came to. Yeah. And it's not so much, sometimes we're confused. Did the rabbis really disagree? No, they could have had the exact same Judaism, the exact same tradition, but in true form of trying to find the truth, why don't we do it this way? Why don't we do it that way? Yeah. And that conversation always was concurrent. That was going on during the times of Moses. That was going on during the times of the Talmud, documented in 60 different volumes, or different numbers depending on which volumes, which edition you have. And that conversation continues still today. And we'll discuss different things. We'll discuss a microwave. We'll discuss Shabbos elevators. But at the end of the day, we're all trying to get knowledge. But here's an even deeper, I think, a fascination with discussion and analysis and disagreement and so on, is that we're told that before the destruction of the Second Temple, people didn't argue. In other words, even if there was an argument, there was never a discussion about the argument. There was never such a thing as people didn't know. Okay. If you know, and I know, so we all agree, what are we talking about? There's even a statement that if a rabbi forgets, a judge rather, forgets a ruling in the Mishnah, then you could throw away the whole court case. Okay. It would be like in the modern day context, if a Supreme Court justice completely neglected constitutional law, just forgot about it, forgot about a very fundamental tenet of, let's say, democracy. Yeah. you'd say, well, clearly they didn't have their Wheaties that morning, so they're missing something.
Yeah.
So let's do a retrial. Let's sort of go back. Let's do this case over again. And you throw the case out because you can't forget the basics. And I think that that's what Judaism was like before the destruction of the Second Temple. Actually, we don't have any record of a disagreement before the Second Temple. So there's no discussions. There's no like Moses said and Aaron disagreed. And obviously there's questioning and there's analysis and there's tons of that going on. We know that because many years later we find records of these discussions and these reasonings and the rationale behind it, which is brilliant. But Hillel and Shammai, this is just one microcosm, and I'll show you the disagreement side and then the synthesis side, which in Chabad we always try to find synthesis in everything. We try to put the pieces that should never go together somehow fit together, beautifully. So Hillel and Shammai are two famous colleagues who argue about just about everything, it seems. But then you actually go to the Talmud and you realize that Hillel and Shammai had 3 disagreements their entire life.
Only 3.
Only 3. So Hillel pretty much developed a school of thought called the School of Hillel, the House of Hillel, of House Hillel. And then you had House of Shammai, or the Academy of Shammai. And they seem, the individuals, Hillel and Shammai, seem to disagree on 3 issues. A generation later, in one generation, after the temple was destroyed, and there were obviously people in both schools, there were students who attended both academies, but different styles of learning. And there were 300 disagreements between the House of Shammai, the Academy of Shammai, and the Academy of Hillel.
After they passed.
And these disagreements many times became divisive in certain ways of practice. Traditionally, by the way, the menorah, the way we light the menorah is a discussion between Hillel and Shammai. Interestingly, we follow the more stringent opinion of Shammai in that we light all 8 candles in ascending order. And that's a tradition today, even in the most secular household, which is ironic.
Yeah.
But back to the point, Hillel and Shammai, the House of Hillel and Shammai seem to disagree. And that coincides perfectly with the destruction of the temple. In other words, as we lost, and there's a few reasonings for this. I think spiritually, that once we lost the spiritual energy of the temple, even though there were many issues with the Second Temple politically and so on, but we still had the temple. We still had a representation of God's presence within the Jewish people. Once that was lost, we lost something spiritually. We lost the fire. We lost the passion, the soul within the Torah to an extent. And it's not that we forgot the Torah, but the Torah became fragmented. The word machloket, which is a disagreement in Hebrew, it comes from the word chelek, which means different parts. When I understand, I think there's a famous analogy of the 3 philosophers who are blind and they meet an elephant, right? And each one is trying to understand what they're looking at or what they're experiencing. So one touches the skin and says, this must be a rhinoceros. And one touches the tail and says, this must be a snake. And one touches the foot and says, this must be a tree. And they're all true, but they're all fractions of the truth. So there's that, you remember that beautiful graphic where you're looking at like a 3-dimensional, what looks like a circle on one side, but a square on the other side, you know what I'm talking about? And it says, this is true, and this is true. And you literally have 3 different shadows. Every shadow is true. One shadow will be a triangle, one shadow will be a circle, one shadow will be a square. They're all true from 3 different perspectives. So what is the truth? The truth is, and if you have to describe it to somebody like I'm doing right now, it is a circle and a square and a triangle at the same time, right? You have to realize that things could have multiplicity or duality or different facets of the same thought, of the same idea. So we can understand and appreciate that Hillel and Shammai had that understanding, and the schools had that understanding. And generally, by the way, we go according to Hillel, which is a much more practical Jewish practice and so on. And this went on for many, many years, this whole Hillel and Shammai dichotomy. Comes along the Rebbe, and this is modern compared to Jewish history, and gives us a perspective on the disagreements between Hillel and Shammai, who seem to not agree on anything. And once we understand that idea, that they're not really disagreeing, you begin to realize that people who are arguing are not really disagreeing. They're simply sharing a perspective that was not shared yet. And the Rebbe's understanding is that what is Hillel's objective? Hillel's objective is, I'm a rabbi. I'm sitting in the books all day. Hillel, I'm sure, was not in self-denial. He knew that he was one of the greatest sages of the Jewish people, probably one of the holiest men who ever lived. There are organizations named after Hillel, right?
Yeah.
There are people named Hillel. Hillel's a magnificent example of how to live. So many moral lessons and ethical lessons and pious lessons learned from Hillel. Hillel says, how do I relate the Torah to the beginner? If a guy says, I want the basic common denominator of Judaism, I want to be Jewish, I want to practice, but don't give me the highest level of practice. Give me the simplest level of practice. Give me the entry level. What could I practice and do while still maintaining Jewish tradition, Jewish practice, and so on? And that's the Academy of Hillel. That's what Hillel's Academy is trying to uncover and trying to discover. Shammai comes from the opposite perspective. Shammai says, yeah, that's all great. What is the gold standard? What is the highest level of understanding? What is the best way to do this mitzvah, to do this practice, to observe this commandment, and so on? So Hillel and Shammai are actually not arguing. They're simply showing you the floor and the ceiling. They're showing you the entry level to Judaism, and they're showing you how unbelievably advanced the mitzvah could be.
Well, I'm sure you can relate that to Judaism today. The different schools of Jewish thought between different observance levels, right? It's like there's the beginner area in every single sect of Judaism, whether it's the intro on the Chabad side or intro on Orthodox or intro. It's like it's different across the board of like there's different levels that you can play at all in the same game, but it's where do you meet people?
So here's the Hasidic perspective on that. The Hasidic perspective is wherever you start from, you have to be growing.
Okay.
You have to be advancing in your Judaism because that's the nature of human beings. That's the nature of the Jew. That's the nature of truth, is that it's always seeking, it's always learning, it's always evolving, right? We gave the example of the dichotomy between the body and the soul. If you want to get a little more Kabbalistic, right? This is segueing, but the body and the soul seem to be opposites. They seem to be antithetical, back to this idea of synchronicity, right? How does a body talk to a soul? How does a soul talk to a body? The whole the book of Tanya is based on this premise, this question, right? Moses says to the Jewish people that this is very accessible. You could become Jewish. You could act as a Jew the way a Jew should and practice and serve God in the best way possible. And the Alter Rebbe, rhetorically, in a sense, in a way of asking to learn, says, really? Is it so easy? Is it so practical? Is it so accessible to be a Jew? Forget about the anti-Semitism. Forget about the outside world. Forget about the external tension. What about internal tension? What about in America in the 21st century when nobody's bothering you for the most part, right? And you're free to do what you want. It's easy. Is Judaism easy? And the answer is it doesn't seem that way. So you need a book of Tanya to really walk you through the steps psychologically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, practically. How do you apply these ideas of the Torah in your life in a very digestible way, which doesn't taste too bad, right? Because anything which tastes too bad, you're not going to want to drink it. So there has to be this progression. And I think that the way you do it is one step at a time from both directions. As the body becomes more refined, the soul is now freer to ascend a little higher. Because there's always going to be this tether between the body and the soul. We talked about this.
Yeah.
How if you're too ambitious spiritually, you're going to suffer physically. And if you are not ambitious enough spiritually, right, then you're going to suffer spiritually because you're not exercising your ability to grow. So there has to be this relationship between the body and the soul in a way that you're learning and you're evolving, but never neglecting yourself.
Okay.
And I think that Judaism in general, and Hasidus in particular, is very, very careful to always consider the entire entity of the person, Jew or non-Jew. Doesn't matter. You have to know yourself. Your soul and your body, your mind and your emotions are not free radicals. They don't get to do whatever they want at the expense of the other. And we know that, and we'll get to the triangulation that I want to get to at the beginning.
Yeah.
We know that if you don't have balance in your life, you don't have synchronicity in your life, you're going to suffer in one way or another. If you're a workaholic, or an alcoholic, if you're a workaholic, then how do you attend to your family? If you don't go to work, how do you support your family? You need to have different focuses of attention in order to be a healthy, wholesome human being. And the same thing applies in Judaism. So in Judaism, there are 3 focal points. Okay. And I could word them, but I'll just simply describe them as: you have the mind, you have the ideas, you have the knowledge, then you have the emotion, the enthusiasm, the passion, the life, the soul, the fire, and then you have practice. You have the behavior. You have the what of Judaism. And when I say a triangulation, it's interesting that it's very common that people are overexposed to one, but not the other. So you have very emotional Jews, very passionate Jews, who might practice. Or it's the converging circles, right?
They're in 2, but not 3 of the
right. And each one, if you have a passionate Jew who practices but doesn't know anything, how sustainable is that? If you have somebody who practices, who knows stuff but has no enthusiasm, right? Checklist Judaism, just check, do what you have to do, but they don't feel anything. They don't feel excited. They're not passionate about it. How long does that last?
And how does it look to the outside world when you see people? Well, I mean, not even the outside world, but to other Jews.
Or your children.
Yeah.
Right?
How enticing is it to do something that's like, yeah, Dad just did the thing again today.
Right.
How do you bridge that gap then?
Sure. And then you also have, right? So you have the practicing, passionate without the knowledge. You have the knowledge and practicing without the emotion, and you have the emotional practicer without knowing what's going on. So you really have to have each aspect of it, and the teachings, the understanding, the rationale of it, we call Torah.
Yeah.
And the practice, the practical, the pragmatic, the what is called the mitzvah. The law, the parameters of Jewish practice, and then the emotion. The emotion, I think, is the most interesting, because I think that in different times of history that was lost, especially because of external influences.
Yeah.
How you really have to have an inner passion, that inner enthusiasm, and that doesn't just come from learning. You have to really be inspired. What inspires you? How do you find that inspiration? And I think that Hasidus, in general, Hasidic thought, which we always call it Hasidic thought, but it really, what it came to do is to defrag Judaism and show where we could use, here's the inner meaning, here's the inner connections, here's the reasoning, but not reasoning only intellectually, also emotionally, to understand and to feel and to become inspired. And I'll share as we wrap it up. I think we're almost at time, but I'll share a story that they say about the Baal Shem Tov.
Okay.
The Baal Shem Tov was the founder of Hasidism, and he would meet these incredible scholars and share with them the inspiration of Judaism. One of the scholars who eventually became a student grew up in a very non-Hasidic background, brilliant scholar called Rabbi Dovber of Mezrich, otherwise known as the Maggid of Mezrich, and this was somebody who his students said about him that there was not a single part of Torah that he had not reviewed 100 times.
Wow.
So every law 100 times, every Kabbalistic idea 100 times, every, the Torah obviously 100 times, the Talmud 100 times, everything he had reviewed, he was fluent.
Yeah.
So the Baal Shem Tov really wanted to meet him, and he finally came into the Baal Shem Tov study, and the Baal Shem Tov shows him a book of Zohar, a book of the Arizal. Arizal wrote commentary on the Zohar, and he says to Rabbi Dovber, "Could you tell me what this says?" And Rabbi Dovber looks at it, and he reads the line and explains it according to his best erudition, according to how he understands it. And the Baal Shem Tov turns to him and says, "That's not what it says. Or that's not what it means." So he looks at it again, takes back the book, thinks for a second, goes through all the different interpretations, and he says, "Yes, it means this." And the Baal Shem Tov again says, "No, that's not what it means." And he, in frustration, he says to the Baal Shem Tov, "You tell me what it means." And the Baal Shem Tov closed his eyes, and he explained the idea according to the Hasidic interpretation. And the Maggid himself said the Baal Shem Tov's face became like fire, and he had to look away. And it was like he was receiving the Torah for the first time. And then the Baal Shem Tov turned to the Maggid and said, you were telling me what it said, but you weren't telling me what it meant. You were giving me the guf, you were giving me the body, you were giving me the practical. You weren't giving me the emotional, you weren't giving me the enthusiasm. And this really started the whole Hasidic movement in that everything has a body and a soul. We have a body and a soul.
Yeah.
Right? I think it was Franklin who said, people die at 25, but they don't get buried till 75.
Yeah.
People lose their enthusiasm for life. People lose their passion. What's critical to life is not just to survive and not just exist, but also to live and to have purpose and passion. And we see people who don't have that, and they're off. They're it's on mute. There's nothing going on there. Not only comatose physically, but also comatose mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And then somehow they get a jolt, they get woken up, and they're a different person, whether in work, business, life, relationships, you name it. So I think that the goal of Hasidic thought and Hasidic teachings and Hasidic nigun, melody and singing and getting together and inspiring each other is really about tapping into that soul, the fire of Torah, the fire of Judaism, the fire of the mitzvah, the passion and enthusiasm for life, for Judaism, and for study and for practice. That we could use that wholesomely to become wholesome ourselves and to be able to serve God with joy and with reverence, as it says in the Torah we should.
I think we could just keep going on for hours and hours.
Yeah,
and hours.
We're going to save some for a future episode.
Well, and I think that's the cool part of this in general, is that, like, at least for me in this period where I'm learning, it just feels like there's so much information that we can just keep, like, every time I ask a question, it's like, I always love sitting there and we have like an hour discussion just about one thing. And then it's like, it just branches and branches and branches. Right. And for me, that's what I've always looked for in Judaism, is like, I just want to understand. And I've found such a difference in the connection, even though I'm not like, I'm always getting better every day, but it's that aspect of just like understanding even the simplest part of what I do on a daily basis changes the entirety of the feeling behind what I'm doing. It's no longer going through the motions. It's that passion behind it. And like the connection just feels so much different. So I'm excited because I'm excited for so many more conversations like this, not just for me, but for all the other people out there that haven't experienced that yet.
So just the analogy that I think we started with off camera of the lobby. Yeah. Maybe give your own perspective what that's been like for you.
Oh my gosh, it's that wandering period where like I was bar mitzvahed, but I never felt connected to Judaism at all. It's like I did it because my mother and my grandmother wanted me to get bar mitzvahed, and then after that I was like done, not connected, and I just felt floating in the ether. I felt like I was just, it's like I'm walking down a hallway and it's like there were just random doors everywhere, and I would like pop in here, look around, but there was always like that drawback to Judaism. And I would walk in, and I explain it as going back to the temples. Like I walked in, and it's like a party, right? You're hanging out, and you explained this to me. It's like you're hanging out, and you walk into the room, and it's a party, and you're having a great time. And then after a while, you're like, "Is this all that there is?" And it's like you ask the question, and someone's like, "There's another door," and then you start, and it's that aspect of like when you finally ask the question, "What else is out there? What else is there in this?" There is somebody that's waiting for you to be like, "Hey, well, this is where everybody starts. There's like another door over here that you can go into," and I'm like, "What do you mean another door? Another what?"
So I think a good way to close this is to encourage those who are listening that there are always questions, and we encourage the questions. We want the questions. We feed off of this, and the better the questions, the better the conversation. And but you can only, there's an old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Yeah. And we are ready to be the teachers. Every Jew is a rabbi. Every Jew is a teacher. Every Jew has to be there. Every person has to be there for another and to share their wisdom and their inspiration with somebody else, with everybody else. And this is the first step in doing that. So thanks for being with us on this beginning of this journey, and to many more and to much more.
Absolutely. I appreciate you inviting me on.
Thanks for coming.
Awesome.